as an example of it, that the system is in crisis because they have made every effort to attempt to convince the people that rules were in fact standards. This whole, this is a rule of law. These are standards. No one's above the law. These kinds of things. So we will believe there is a set of standards that are universally applied. Okay. But now the system in such crisis that it can't afford that anymore. It can't afford the facade, the veneer of fairness anymore. It's, well, we would like to continue to, dupe the people, but right now we're in crisis. And I think the crisis is this. I mentioned this book, How to Hide an Empire, that the system generally works very hard to hide from its citizens that it is an imperialist system. That instead it's like we're just going around the world doing good things, helping other people. This is not about imperialism. That's silly. The Russians, they're the imperialists. The Chinese, everybody's the imperialist but us. And so it's very, they always have to show that. But as we look at the financial meltdown that we're in the midst of, when you look at the numbers, you look at what's going, when you look at the rise of countries who aren't going to go along with the system, they're so desperate they can't afford the facade anymore. And now it's just like, we got to do whatever we can to get out from under this mess to regain control. And then we'll go back to the facade later if we can. What do you think about that evaluation of the situation, Joti?
I think that's right. Yes, the system is in crisis and the crises are getting deeper, and it's been growing for some time. And that's why so many strands of alienation and disaffection amongst the people are growing and piling up. It was very interesting to me to see how receptive the people outside the courtroom on Tuesday. I went down with some of my party members and we had a little table there, a stall with some of our literature. And after the some of the people who come out from the court at lunchtime to give us a little update what was happening, and that kind of official bit of rally had finished, we did our own little pop-up rally. And, I spoke, a couple of other people spoke, then we did a bit of an open mic. And what was really interesting to me, Garland, was to see how much more receptive to a message we have always brought. Our message isn't really any different than it was 15, 20 years ago. But the way that people respond to it has changed. And it's a result of this deepening crisis. And it's also a factor that's exacerbating it, right? That it's getting harder to control the narrative. And the more people wake up to that and start looking for alternative sources and finding out information for themselves and finding different people to talk to and different organizations and media outlets to try to get information from that feels like more like closer to the truth, more truthful, the harder that becomes again and again. And you see this sort of real fear of how the numbers for the MSM media just keep sinking. And that increasingly the people who watch it are the people who are in some way connected to the system. So it's like a real echo chamber. And it's no longer an effective weapon for controlling the minds of the masses. Now, I'm not saying that the vast mass of the people are awake. I don't think they are. But I also don't think they're as tuned into mass media as they once were. And that is exacerbating the situation of crisis and the fear and panic amongst our rulers of, what the hell do they do? And they do this thing of trying to, the mainstream media will politely report that, in the court, Julian's lawyers said it was political, but US said it wasn't, and then they sort of leave it like that, that's the, and you're like, what? But it isn't. It is political. Obviously it is, right? And they just say, oh, the US said it wasn't. And that's their reporting, Julian's lawyer said it was, but the US said it wasn't. And that's the end of the job of journalism, and, that might tick the boxes for people who are not yet waking up. But for a lot of people, that is really unsatisfactory now. And for a lot more people, they're just simply tuned out altogether, I think. It's interesting when you look at how the law really works, as opposed to how we've been told it works. You know, we've been told for all our lives that it's about keeping people safe and keeping society kind of working properly and protecting, like you said, protecting standards of human decency. We sort of have this idea in our mind that that's what the law is. But if you actually look at the law, and if you go right back into history, back to the days when Britain had, I mean, you still have the death penalty in parts of the USA, right? If you go back to the days when Britain had the death penalty and people used to get hung at Tyburn Tree, there was a preponderance of those who were actually hung were for crimes against property. And that is still the same. You know, there's a saying, I'm not sure where it comes from, 9/10 of the law is property. And really, if you understand that about the legal system, that its main job is to protect the interests of the property owners. And the bigger your property owning is, the more right you have to protection, right? So you are the little person with a little house who gets burgled by another poor person and some of your stuff is taken. Don't expect the police to be bending over backwards over that, right? But somebody with a big business interest who's threatened, who some of that is taken away from them in unlawful ways, you know, then they can expect the police to get involved. And the biggest protection of all comes from the state for the imperialists, for their preservation of their right to be exploiters, to stay on top, to keep doing what they do. And this is really, I think, how we have to see Julian's persecution. He has not committed a crime that they can find codified anywhere. In fact, he's upholding things that they've always told us are an inalienable part of a functioning democracy. Holding truth, holding power to account, telling truth to power. Don't they tell us these phrases, right? But really doing it in an effective way, in a way where the crimes of the powerful are exposed and their position is undermined socially with the masses. That is a crime in their book. It's a crime against their property. And that's what they're persecuting and targeting him for.
And I think, you know, here's a thought I have. Okay, when you say government secrets or government information and somebody spreads them, here's a question that comes into my mind. Whose secrets are they? Who has a right to know? You know what I mean? Okay, if you're arguing to me that this government is for the people, that people elect these people, that we can hold them accountable, that this a government answers to the people, represents the people, etc. Okay, then Julian Assange says the government's doing this, and I'm going to bring that information to the people, and the government says, oh no, you cannot do that. You'll go to jail, you'll be punished, you'll die for that. It comes down to, well, wait a minute. That means that the things that the government are doing, the government, I'll put it to you like this. The government has a right to tap my phone. The government has a right to listen to what I'm doing, read my emails, to know my information, to listen to me on the phone, talking to friends and blah, 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 which no doubt they do all the time, you know, because I'm a Russian bot or whatever, a Chinese or Iran loving North Korean supporter, I guess, to them. But I don't have a right to do that to the government. They have to know everything that I'm doing, and they can invade my most private information. But if the government lies to me about what they're doing, and Julian Assange says they're lying, here's what they're actually doing, then I don't have this thing goes one way, not the other way. Joti.
Absolutely. And that tells you a truth about the system, that for all its veneer of being for everybody, it is not. The state is a mechanism, is a machinery for keeping the ruling class in power and the working class in its place. And it will use whatever means it feels it needs in order to do that. And, you know, Karl Marx documented how through the gradual transitions from different types of stages of development of class societies, you know, the earliest class society was the slave owners over the slaves. Then we had the feudal landlords over the feudal lords over the serfs. Then we have the capitalists over the workers. And then, of course, as Lenin documented, capitalism turns into imperialism, you know, monopoly capitalism, where the ruling class becomes fewer, but insanely richer, you know, and capital just keeps growing and growing and growing to become this sort of incredible hoard of wealth in the hands of very, very tiny number of super, super powerful people, then the machinery needed to keep a tiny number of people in power above a huge mass of people becomes ever more massive and complex and oppressive. And at each change in the level of exploitation, the state machine becomes bigger, more intrusive, more professional, more sort of omnipresent, if you like, and more intrusive. And this is an absolute necessity for maintaining the status quo. So you can't argue that, oh, well, we want capitalism, but without a massive state machinery. You can't have it. You have to recognize these things go hand in hand. Capitalism, free trade capitalism, turned into monopoly capitalism. Monopoly capitalism turned into militarism, turned into a huge, huge state machinery at home, and imperialism and ransacking, looting the globe abroad. That is the inevitable development of capitalism. And the only way out is forwards that way into socialism. There's not a way of making capitalism fair and nice. But I think this mythology about what capitalism ought to be, we've talked before about the mythology of what it used to be, which is basically mythology. There was never this halcyon day when everything was fair and nice, right? That never happened. The early days of the capitalist system were not just a bunch of nice entrepreneurs who were competing in a nice way with one another. The world was being drenched in blood right from the beginning. In order to free the workers from serfdom, to be free from having any way to make their living on the land, and therefore free to come and be laborers for the capitalist enterprises in the towns, first manufacturers and then industrial manufacturing, they did the enclosures, right? They took away the common lands that enabled the peasants to feed themselves. The enclosures. They did it in England first, then in Scotland, Wales, and the very earliest days of going to the colonies, before capitalism was really fully developed, but stealing the gold and silver of the Americas, the gold from India, and then later on slaves from Africa. But all of this was how capitalism got its early accumulation going. If you read Karl Marx's Capital, he talks about this period of what he calls primitive accumulation. Beginning capitalism was this process of amassing large amounts of capital in order to be able to invest it in big projects, to build manufactories, and later an industrial revolution to fund that was done by stealing, suffering, and at the expense of blood of people all over the world. So there was never this nice type of capitalism, right? But of course, the machinery now has become absolutely enormous to the point where everybody's aware of how intrusive it is, and this idea of that it shouldn't be like that, and people feel outrage about it, is an interesting one, because I think it's another way in which you see what Karl Marx said about the capitalist system. He said what it produces more than anything else is its own gravediggers. Now, why is it that the workers, although they don't have rights, think they should have rights? Well, that's a boomerang effect of a historical process of awakening the working masses to political consciousness. Why? It was always in the interest of capital. Back in the days of the English Civil War, the parliamentarians started to mobilize sections, particularly in the towns, of the artisans, the apprentice boys, onto their side in the name of human rights. In the name of, we're all equal before, they said, all equal before God, and we should all be equal before the law, and everyone should have the right to have property, and you shouldn't have to be a noble, born to it, to be able to have rights and do business, right? And to buy an estate, you should be able to earn enough money and buy an estate, and you shouldn't have to be born to an estate. Like, that's not fair, is it? So they mobilized people with this idea of equality. That's what Protestantism was all about. It was about it facilitating the rise of capitalism, as opposed to Catholicism, which was part of the machinery of feudalism in Europe, right? So this whole thing of starting to tell the ordinary people that they have rights before God, rights before the law, rights to take part in the political life of the land. And then as capitalism developed in Britain, you saw, and I'm sure this happened everywhere else, I just know Britain better, but you saw how disputes between sections of the ruling class, and particularly in Britain, you had a kind of manufacturing urban bourgeoisie, and you still had a landowning aristocracy, and they were both the ruling class, but they had different interests and clashing interests often. They would each try to mobilize the masses into their corner at various times. So, for example, the landowners mobilized the workers. The bourgeoisie mobilized the workers against the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws had kept the price of agricultural products high, so that they were protected from, it was like tariffs, to protect them from cheaper corn coming from elsewhere, corn being all kinds of grains, right? And the bourgeoisie said to the workers, this is terrible, this is really unfair for you, your bread's really expensive, we need to abolish these tariffs and make bread cheaper, and then your life will be better. And the workers were mobilized into political activity. Now, as soon as the Corn Laws were abolished, guess what? Wages were cut. So the benefit of bread being cheaper didn't go to the workers, it went to the bourgeoisie, went to the owners of industry. They had been mobilized, though, for the fight. Now, the problem with all this mobilizing the workers to be politically conscious and to be engaged in what happens in Parliament and what are your betters up to is you break down this wall that says, no, it's none of my business. In the feudal system, no worker had the idea that it was his business, whatever the ruling class was up to. Of course, he knew it wasn't. They're my betters, and they're the ones who were born to rule the land, and I'm the one who's born with my nose in the dirt, and I just have to get on with hoeing and sowing and, know my place. But once you've told the workers that they have a place in political life, in running the affairs, having an opinion on the affairs of the day and who represents them and who doesn't, you can't put that genie back in the box. The truth of this system is the democracy is actually, we've talked about this before, right? That democracy is actually really only for the ruling class, but they have to mobilize us on their side against one another. And in doing so, they create this illusion there. And then they give us the story that democracy is for everybody. But then they create expectations that they can't fulfill. And as you said, the deeper the crisis goes, the less they're fulfilling all of our expectations, and the more the crisis deepens, because the more workers are sort of outraged. Why are we being ignored? I remember how massively the 2003, the ignoring of the 2003 anti-war movement had an impact on the mentality of people who up until then had assumed that the people in power are operating in a well-meaning way, and that they're open, that they want to represent the people, and they're trying to represent the people. And if enough of us go on the street and show them you're not representing us, that will make them stop and think. They believed that. And it was shocking when they found that the ruling class and the government felt very happy to ignore that protest, because they knew the leadership wasn't going to give it the kind of leadership that would get it to actually stop the war. You had 2 million people on the streets, Garland. Imagine if the people on the podium had done this. What they actually did was say, well done. Oh, it's amazing. You've made history. Biggest demo ever. You're amazing. We're all amazing. Go home. See you next time. 2 million people, Garland. They could have sent a section to blockade Parliament. They could have sent a section to blockade Whitehall. They could have sent a section to blockade the stock exchange. They could have sent a section to blockade RAF Northolt and wherever else the planes were taking off from. They could have literally ground the war machine to a halt with those people who are out on the streets. But they sent them home. And the ruling class knew they were going to send them home because they are a controlled and tame opposition. But imagine if that hadn't been the case, the power those people have. So, this awakening of people to an understanding that their rulers can't be trusted, that the system's not on their side, that the rules aren't really rules at all. This is all part of deepening the crisis and making it harder and harder for our rulers to keep their power in the same old way.
That's interesting. I was also thinking about what you're saying in regards to 2003. through the context of the Gaza genocide, in that the numbers are astounding. In 2003, I was at I went to the march in Washington, D.C., which was huge. It was giant. And of course, they said there was 10,000 people. That was 400,000. Okay. The march in D.C. regarding Gaza was larger. It was unbelievable. Number one. Both of them. But the first one, both of them were at least as big, but one was definitely larger. Okay. 80% of Democrats, according to polls, are for a Medicare for all, a system where everyone in the U.S. gets healthcare coverage. Between 70 and 80% of the people want what they refer to as a permanent ceasefire. What I simply call is they want to end the war. Permanent ceasefire. It's pretty much the definition of ending, not the war, the genocidal attack on Gaza. Okay, it's exactly what you said. Ruling elite could care less. The Biden administration sitting there, 80% of the people say we want something. No, you're not getting it. Forget it. And I recall Nancy Pelosi saying, even if the Capitol that Washington in D.C. crumbles, if everything else falls, our support for Israel will not waver. If you're saying if the buildings around me crumble, I'm not going to waver. What you're also saying is no matter what the people who are ostensible constituents want, we're going to go with what the ruling elite wants. I got to add one other thing to it. A lot of people are familiar with this. Regarding the Ukraine crisis, Annalena Baerbock said that we're going to continue to support Ukraine. She says, no matter what the German voters want. Again, we're getting a crisis of imperialism where they're saying, look, Russia, China, the North Korea, Iran, these other countries are starting to rise. We don't care what you voters want. We got to try to stop this, because this is a crisis for the ruling elite having total and complete power over everything. So Annalena Baerbock, Gaza, etc. These are perfect examples of the ruling elite now again saying, look, the crisis is too big. You have no say in this. And we're not going to bother to hide it from you anymore, which means we need more censorship. We're going to have to do it. We can't allow, if we're going to make it obvious that we're ignoring what you're saying, that we don't work for you, we're not going to listen to you, then we can't allow people like Julian Assange and others, say Garland, Nixon, and Joti, Brar, to go running around saying, hey guys, look over here, getting kind of obvious now. Joti.
I'm going to add another one to your list, Garland. I agree with you fully. The Israeli Knesset, day before yesterday, I think, this week anyway, voted that it will never accept any kind of Palestinian state. So you've got the International Court of Justice right now, standing solemnly hearing all of this, horrific testimony that's been, none of which is new, but once again, under pressure of international opinion and this desperation that the UN ought to do something, ought to be the body that settles these problems once and for all and creates a fair and just world order. Of course, it doesn't do that because it's under the control of the USA fundamentally, but from below there's this pressure. No, it's got to happen through the UN, and all of these people lining up and putting these very cogent, coherent, and sometimes, heart-wrenching testimonies to explain what's happening in Palestine, who's the criminal, who's not the criminal, why the Palestinians have the right to resist. The Chinese representative yesterday gave a little speech where he explained, he just listed all of the bits of international law and UN resolutions which reaffirm the right of the oppressed, occupied, colonized peoples to resist by force of arms. Reminding people that it's not the Palestinians who are the terrorists, it's the Israelis. And meanwhile, you have the Israeli Knesset saying, and they're still talking in the UN endlessly about the two-state solution, like it's a viable option. And at the same time, you have the Israeli Knesset saying, we don't care about any of that. They had the order for a kind of cessation came from the UN, and they just went, nothing to do with us. We know we don't have to listen to that. When do the Israelis know they have to listen? When the US stopped sending bombs. Now, what do we see? We see spokespeople at the White House say, oh, yes, we try very. We see Joe Biden. Oh, I tried very. I'm always talking to Bibi, you know, and telling him that it would be a really good idea if he takes care of the poor Palestinians. We wouldn't like, it really hurts us. You know, Anthony Blinken, oh, gosh, it just hurts me so much to see Palestinians dying. Isn't it awful? Meanwhile, you know, signing orders, send the bombs, send the bombs, send the bombs, send the bombs. The day they stop sending the bombs is the day that Israel has to stop bombing, right? Likewise, with the Israeli lobby, you know, they present us a picture as if the lobby came out of nowhere or just came spontaneously out of Israel. But how can the Israeli lobby have so much money? Israel isn't that rich. Israel exists because of its subsidies from the USA. So this is a circular operation. A load of money is sent to Israel and then it's sent back to the USA. And most of the Zionists who fund Zionism, the official worldwide Zionist movement, are not Israelis. They're Americans. They're American big business. So the Israeli lobby is really a Zionist lobby. And the Zionist lobby is a faction of the US ruling class, and it's extremely, hugely powerful. And why is it so central? It's not because Israel is in charge of the USA. It's so central because controlling the oil of the Middle East is a #1 priority for US imperialism and for British imperialism too. And that's why they're handing glove over it. It was, after all, Britain which created Zionism and created Israel, right? Fundamentally. And this, they show us by their actions that the rules don't apply to them. You know, Israel is exempt from the rules because the USA shields it. And they've become so arrogant in saying all of that out loud because they know the USA will continue to shield them. And because they have that shielding, they've thrown away all their pretense. You know, on the one hand, they're outraged by the fact that Palestinians are still there and still resisting. And how dare they not understand that they were supposed to have left the land because it's the land that God gave us and we're God's chosen people. And on the other hand, they have this eternal protective shield provided by the fact that the USA gives them weapons and money, and the USA controls the only bit of the UN that's empowered to do anything, which is the Security Council. And the US has a veto. And for as long as the US exercises its veto in the Security Council, every single other thing the UN ever does means nothing. And this is something which, again, is becoming clearer and clearer and clearer to people who have these hopes, this faith in some kind of a law-based order when we live in a system of imperialism where might is right and things are controlled on the basis of protecting private property and protecting the ability of the super rich to continue to exploit.
You know, one of the things that I'm reading about what's happening in the Red Sea. And I find that I'm reading this article, and there's a U.S. Coast Guard boat that's boarding vessels, searching for, as they called, smuggled goods from Iran. And they, you know, according to them, a couple of Navy SEALs fell overboard, blah, blah, blah. And what they say is that they took the people off the boat, and the U.S. charged them with smuggling goods and smuggling illegal goods and blah, blah, blah. And the first thing I thought is, well, wait a minute. In the Red Sea, on one side, on one shore, there's Black people, Africans, etc., right? On the other shore, there's Muslims. You got Yemen over here, and then you've got all, you know, of the whole area. You got Somalia and Eritrea and blah, blah, blah. Okay. There's no U.S. coast there for the U.S. Coast Guard. And number two, what jurisdiction? What is the venue? Under what? The United States? What can we now, if we were able to go to Mars and we land on Mars and another country has landed on Mars, we'll go charge them with trespassing on Mars because, I don't know, trespassing is illegal in the United States, technically. So let me add something about trespassing, and this is important. A lot of Americans don't know this. Let's say you rent a house from me. You have no right as the renter in the United States to claim trespassing against someone only the actual landowner. So you live in that house, right? Let's say I rent a house. Somebody comes in, I say, you can't come in, and the person comes in anyway. He does whatever they want, wanders around on the property and leave. And I say to call the police, I want to charge that person with trespassing. In the US, the police will say, I must talk to the actual owner. And I can't charge the person unless the actual owner of the property comes to court and testifies they didn't want the person on there. The leasee, the renter, has no right, no right to the property, no right to tell someone else they can't. It's not trespassing if the renter says you can't come on this property, only if the actual owner of the property. I think that's an example of the way they see it here. And I don't know if that ties along with what's going on with the US and the Red Sea, basically saying we're the landowner of the Red Sea. We are the Coast Guard's in the Red Sea guarding the US coast, because according to imperialism, the US coast is the entire United States. Anyway, your thoughts on those couple of things? I think that the trespassing thing is completely is quite enlightening in regards to the ruling elite saying, and what you were saying, the landowner owns it. If you rent it, it ain't yours, and you got no rights. Anyway, go ahead.
I think that does tell you something about the imperialist mentality, Garland, which is, there was famously, I'm trying to remember who it was, I'm sorry, some US president, I think, or someone high up in the US establishment said, it's not our fault all these Arabs are living on top of our oil. And that epitomizes that statement that you just said. Now, I grew up in Britain in a fading empire, which had used to be the world's preeminent, first, biggest, strongest imperialist power. And there was a song we used to sing that was left over from those days called Rule Britannia. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. The inference being everybody else can be a slave, right? Our slave. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. So again, we're you look at the map, Britain's a small place off the edge of Europe, but surrounded by sea. But Britain worked out, Britain's expansion around the world was based on naval power. And controlling and patrolling the seas leads to your ability to then control the land and access to the land and to and from the land. And we did an awful lot of before in the build up to becoming a land hogging power. We were very much into piracy, and piracy was a kind of official activity of British sailors and lords back in the Elizabethan type of era, and for quite a while afterwards, there were blessed pirates. There were pirates who were carrying out British aims and objectives in the seas, if you like. So this idea, it's really interesting. That they say they're complaining about smuggling between two countries over which, as you say, they have no jurisdiction. So they've inserted themselves and appointed themselves the arbiters of, what is allowed to happen anywhere on the globe. And they said, smuggled goods from Iran. Who said Iran's not allowed to trade with Yemen? Oh, the USA says it. On what basis? On the basis that it offends them because they're trying to strangle Yemen and they're trying to strangle Iran, and it offends them if Iran and Yemen get together and trade with one another and help one another. No country in the world is allowed to help another country unless it has the blessing of the imperialists. That's essentially it. And of course, it never does have, because real help means helping a country to have sovereignty over its own territory. And the imperialists fundamentally don't recognize the sovereignty of oppressed peoples, the colonized peoples, and they never really have recognized the sovereignty. The spread of national liberation around the world, which followed, let us not forget, repetition is the key to learning, Garland, or alternatively, this is how I bore your audience rigid. It was the October Revolution, which kicked off the wave of national liberation, consciousness, sentiment, organization, struggle, and victory. Right? It all began from the socialist revolution in Soviet Russia, which was also a national liberation revolution, which freed the oppressed, colonized parts of the Russian Empire and gave them all a choice. Said to them, you can freely join our Soviet Union as an independent socialist republic and become part of a bigger union, or you can go your own way. Finland, for example, had been part of the Russian Empire, and Finland, there was a revolutionary fight in Finland, and the counter-revolutionaries won. And they said, we don't want to be part of your socialist Soviet Union. And I think it was Stalin actually went and signed the document, said, okay, you're free. That's your choice, Finland, right? We think you'll be better with us, but it's up to you. And they did that everywhere. You know, Ukraine had its separate revolutionary struggle, and revolutionary Ukraine decided that it wanted to join the Soviet Union as a free and equal partner. There was no coercion. You know, we're always presented with the idea that the Soviet Union was an empire. It was the anti-empire, and it was the proof to the peoples of the world that there's another way to coexist with other nations, which is a cooperative, friendly way, which is what China always talks about: win-win cooperation. We can exist with each other, next to each other. We can trade with one another. We can treat each other with respect, no matter who's big and who's little. You know, and this national liberation sentiment was spread around the globe since the days of the Soviet Union, and it can't be put back in its box now. You know, sovereignty is something that the peoples of the world believe in, and the United Nations has had to accept international law. Again, you've got to remember history. At the time these conventions were made, the Soviet Union was in the world, and their international law is shaped by the fact that the Soviet Union existed. And because the Soviet Union was there to counterbalance the USA and force the USA to say things in public otherwise it wouldn't have said, and the British, it's enshrined in international law that there's such a thing as the right to self-determination. That right came from Marxism. Nobody talks about that, but that's where it came from. Originally, it was formulated by Marx and Engels in the early days in Europe. Then it was Lenin who spread that idea and said every colonized people has the right to self-determination, right? And it was enshrined in the Bolsheviks' program at the time of the October Revolution. They carried it out. That then became part of international law because the Soviet Union existed. So people don't understand their history. Things we think of as inalienable human rights only came into our minds because of socialism. And they were a concession from the imperialists under pressure of the advance of socialism. They had to make themselves look more democratic than they were, look like they cared about human rights when they didn't really. In that situation, we had the Nuremberg trials. In that situation, we had a whole load of conventions and laws and resolutions passed at the UN and all this stuff codified, which said things which came from the socialist program, i.e. every nation, including Palestine, has the right to self-determination. People have the right to resist colonization by armed struggle. Now, you can't imagine that this was easily wrung out of people like the British, who had been colonizing all over the world and who were kicked out of their colonies painfully by armed liberation movements all over the place. You know, Kenya is one that springs to my mind straight away, and tried very fiercely to repress those movements, right? They didn't give up easily. They didn't give up because they have a belief in the inalienable right of human beings. They absolutely didn't. But under pressure, the United Nations had to enshrine these things in law, and many times it's reiterated them. So you have this contradiction, don't you, between the consciousness of the peoples, which is a national liberation consciousness, and they don't know it comes from socialism, but it does. A belief that nations have the right not to be oppressed and exploited by imperialism, to live in dignity and in brotherhood with other nations on terms of equality, whether they're small or large, poor or rich. And then you have the mentality of the imperialists, which is, I own the world, everyone is subject to me, and my capital is what determines everything. And anything that gets in the way of my capital's ability to loot, plunder, exploit, rip profits out of any part of the globe, any activity that's happening anywhere in the globe that's not making profit for my capital is not to be tolerated. It's got to be turned into something that makes a profit for my capital, which is growing and growing and needs more and more places to settle and rinse.
Last but not least, I'm going to throw something at you I want to get your thoughts on. The when something I've said in the past in discussions, and I just want to get your thought, and that is, I'm just going to put it together. When I've talked about why is it Russia, Latin America, China align so well, right? Why do they align? Having traveled in South America, and here's what I saw. What do the people in South America want? For the most part, I see this over and over. We have whatever. We have this natural resource, whatever it is, oil, gold, whatever, right? What they want is for the government to sell this stuff, right? Let's say you've got oil in Venezuela under Chavez. What do you want to happen? I want the government to sell the oil. I want the government to then take that money, use it to run the government, use it to help the poor, use it to give us health care, education, things of that nature, right? What else do we have? Oh, we've got, some other kind of natural resources, whatever it is, right? We've got nickel, we've got this, we've got that. I want the government to sell it and use that money for the benefit of the people, right? What does China do? China says we're going to have all of these companies. 70% of it is going to be government owned. Say 30% of it will be private. We're going to make all of this money, and we're going to bring 800 million people out of poverty. Same thing. The government sells this stuff, uses the money. Now let's talk about Russia, which is okay. We say that's a capitalist country, whatever. However, Russia has these gigantic companies that are government companies that sell gas, that sell oil, etc. And what do? Well, they build the subway in Moscow. They build things, they do things, right? Again, that concept of we've got these vast natural resources, these powerful natural resources. And rather than allow Exxon, BP, ConocoPhillips to come in to take the resources, to sell them, and just put the money in the hands of the people, the shareholders of the company, and the people who own the company, and everyone else be damned. Russia has to some extent, they're doing that also. So regardless of what you call Russia, they still have an element that aligns with what China's doing, that aligns with what these South American countries and various countries are doing, that what they're saying in Africa. Ibrahim Traore, the leader of Burkina Faso, why is it that we have all of these natural resources and we're poor? What is he saying? The natural resources should be used for the benefit of the people, not a few people. And to me, I've often joked the United States is fighting to make the world free for corporate oligarchs, right? I hear in Africa the same thing. Use the natural resources for the benefit of the people. And no matter what you call Russia, to a large extent, gas, oil, etc., they're doing that. Anyway, your thoughts?
You pinpointed something really important, Garland, which is if you are an anti-imperialist country, even if you're not socialist, you might be a capitalist country, which has a bourgeoisie which wants to make profits from its own resources and is crushed by the oppression of, or could be crushed by the oppression of and super exploitation by imperialist concerns. They want freedom to be capitalists in their own land without having to pay this huge tribute that crushes them. In an anti-imperialist country, in this world, where you are surrounded by the power of imperialism, and as soon as you stand up to imperialism, they target you incessantly and horrifically. You can't be fighting your own people as well as fighting the imperialists simultaneously. Now, when you have a small clique running a country that has nominal independence, but in reality is a fiefdom of imperialism, and they have a small comprador class in charge, which helps them to do that, those people are very, very unpopular with the masses in their country, but they have the power of imperialism behind them to keep them in place. You can't have a ruling class in a poorer country, which is being faced by imperialism on one hand and threatened by its people on the other hand. The government wouldn't stay in power for a week. Right? It's not possible to face imperialism and the masses simultaneously. So if you are going to try and be sovereign as a country, sovereign, not socialist, sovereign, In the era of imperialism, you must deliver something for your masses. You must be a government that has a popular aspect, that's doing things that people approve of. So when imperialism comes for you, the people are going to line up behind you and see you as their defense against imperialism, see that they have a better life with you than they would have under imperialism. So the level of exploitation can't be as rampant as it might be if it was just, open, just laissez-faire capitalism. There has to be elements of welfare. You see that in Iran, you see it in Russia, you see it in Syria, you see it in many places, in Venezuela. Of course, Venezuela is something different. It's the kind of halfway house, but you don't have to be full socialist to understand. If you want to stand up to the imperialists, you're going to have to do something for your people. And so that's the first thing I wanted to say. And then just talking a little bit about this concept of sovereignty. I think that the cases of Venezuela and North Korea are very illustrative to us. They're very educational to us to understand what sovereignty is really made of in this particular era that we're living in, when imperialism tries to crush everybody who wants to be sovereign. Venezuela voted in a government and kept that government in power, which promised to use the oil wealth to benefit the people. And it fulfilled its promise because it had socialist aspirations. It didn't turn Venezuela socialist overnight. Venezuela still doesn't have a socialist economy. Most of its economy is still controlled by capitalists. And that creates huge problems for the poor in Venezuela. But they have a social system safety net to stop the poor from starving and keep the poor in housing and all the rest of it, right? So they have this halfway house, but the government has been loyal to its promise. We will use any oil wealth we have to take care of the people. What happened? They were strangulated. And we saw that Venezuela's economy was almost entirely oriented. It had been set up as a colony, a fiefdom of the USA, and its entire economy was oriented towards the USA. Even the way that its oil was refined was connected to the USA. So as with the ties to the USA and the USA market cut off, its ability to reorient was almost non-existent. It's been incredibly difficult and painful for Venezuela to try to develop other bits of its economy under sanctions, so you can't get materials in to do things. They can't have concrete to build houses, for goodness sake. They're literally there going, right, how can we build houses with, what else have we got that we can build houses with, because we can't get concrete, and it's the same, with the oil industry. One of the things that really upsets the imperialists is this growing rapprochement between Venezuela and Iran, because Iran has experience in oil refining and can help Venezuela to reorient and reshape its oil manufacturing industry. It also has experience in other things. And, Venezuela is very slowly trying to build up its agriculture, build up other aspects of its industry in the face of blockade and horrible situation. But this has been a very slow, painful process and very difficult for the people. Now, if you look at North Korea, you see something very interesting, which is, unlike Cuba, at the time of the Cuban Revolution, it was part of the kind of Soviet bloc, and the Soviets said, you give us sugar and rum, we'll give you what you need. Happy days. It worked until there was no Soviet Union, and then Cuba was in massive trouble, and still is in massive trouble because it's a little island and the US can physically blockade it. And it's very, very hard for them to get materials they need to develop their economy in other ways, although they do try. The DPRK was offered a similar deal. You can send us lots of fruits and various agricultural products and we'll give you what you need. And they said, no, thank you. In order to be sovereign, we need to develop our economy in an all-round way. And what does that mean? It means you have to develop heavy industry, because heavy industry is the basis of all real economic development. And it means you have to go for economic, militarily and technological independence. These are the ways in which you ensure real sovereignty in the real world conditions in which we actually live. And 75 years later, we see the wisdom of North Korea's approach. Because the USA hasn't been able to make war on it, even up until today, although it's desperately trying and desperate still to bring down the North Koreans, hasn't been able to starve the North Korean people, or is always telling us that it's starved, that, the North Korean people are starving. They haven't managed to starve the North Korean people. They have the most impressive army. They've developed some real impressive high tech, not just in terms of weapons, but for other things, in terms of their agriculture as well. They have free housing. They have amazing free education. So, sovereignty in the end comes from developing your economy in a meaningful way from the base up, and that means heavy industry up.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, I saw someone in the chat, and this is the thing about the US, that's how successful the imperialists are in brainwashing their people, right? They said, oh, but millions of people are fleeing Venezuela. The United States sanctions literally cut out 99% of Venezuela's income. 99%. And then the US said, look at Venezuela. People are leaving Venezuela. Look at them. They're struggling. They're mishandling their money. Oh, they're terrible. Venezuela's being misled. Imagine anyone who lost 99% of their income due to the malevolent actions of someone who literally said, we're going to destroy your economy. We're going to destroy it. Then you lose 99% of your income. And then someone's like, look at those, look at Garland. He's mismanaging the 1% of his income. Look at Garland. People are fleeing his home. He's running out looking for food. You know, that would be like blaming the people of Gaza for look at these people of Gaza. They're starving. They have no water, their food. They just really don't know how to manage the genocide that's being oppressed, that they're being experienced. That's the brainwashing of American people.
What terrible parents they are, Garland. They can't keep their kids safe.
Exactly. That is the brainwashing of the U.S. empire, to brainwash the people where they can pound the working class of another country, wipe them out and destroy them, and then convince their people that it is the country that they're wiping out that is responsible. So therefore, that kind of implies that they'd be far better if they had our system, doesn't it? It kind of implies that we should go in there and save them so that they can have a financialized system. They can be $34 trillion in debt. They can have homeless people all over the place. The people can be ready to revolt in the street, because then they'd have good old fashioned democracy. You know, but at any rate, you get the point. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time. Where can people find you? Where can people find more info about what you're doing? Where can people, if they want to work with you, all the stuff, what websites, etc., do people need to go to?
So my party website, which I am the editor of, is thecommunists.org. You can search for me on Telegram. I have a Telegram channel called Joti Brar, and we also have a party Telegram channel called The Communists. Nice and easy to find. Don't be fooled by the fact that there's a state-organized little Trotskyite outfit recently trying to take our clothes, calling itself The Communist. Would you believe?
Ah, with no S, of course. Oh, yeah, that's MI6.
Yeah. So you can find me there. There's also the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, which has something called Platform News on Telegram. I do advise people to just be on Telegram. It's much better than all the other social medias. If you want to find me on the other social medias, I am Joti2 with the number 2 Gaza on Twitter. That's about it. Yeah, thecommunist.org. Go there.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. As always, don't forget, I'm on rockfin.com. I'm also on Rumble. So if for some reason they throw me off of YouTube, you'll still be able to find me, follow me. I'm on Facebook for what it's worth. I'm on Telegram, and I'm certainly not on X, because people like me are far too dangerous to be allowed on X, because we may say unacceptable things. Thanks a lot, Joti Brar. Great job as always. And I really appreciate it that you take time out of your busy schedule to hang out with us, with the little people.
I'm one of you, mate.